All right, so today we're going to dive into Guyanese politics.
Okay.
There's a big election coming up, and there's this huge debate about using biometric voter ID.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's not just about technology.
Right.
You know, it gets into like whether a country can have an election that is both secure and accessible.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
It's a tension that exists in democracies all around the world.
Right.
And in Guyana, this isn't just theoretical. You know, the opposition parties are really pushing for biometrics.
Yeah.
Saying it's the only way to prevent the kind of fraud that they allege happened in the last election.
Yeah, from what I've read, it sounds like the ruling PPP party is pushing back hard on that.
Yeah.
They're saying that biometrics could actually make it harder for people to vote, not easier. So,
Yeah.
like, what's their reasoning there?
Well, the General Secretary, Dr. Bharat Jagdeo, called the whole biometric issue a smokescreen. He even said the opposition wants, quote, multiple fronts to claim on election day that there was rigging going on. It seems like they're trying to frame this as a deliberate attempt to, like, sow chaos and distrust in the process.
So they're essentially saying the opposition is trying to undermine the election before it even happens.
Yeah, pretty much.
But, I mean, the opposition has legitimate concerns about fraud, right?
Right.
Haven't there been issues in the past?
That's right. Allegations of voting irregularities and fraud have been a recurring theme in Guyanese politics. But Jagdeo insists that there's no evidence to back up any of the fraud claims from the 2020 election.
That's interesting.
And that raises a really important question.
What's that?
If there's no concrete evidence, does this push for biometrics start to look more like a political tactic than a genuine concern for election integrity?
Yeah, that's a good point, but it seems like a bit of a tricky situation because even if there isn't hard evidence, perceptions matter, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like if a large portion of the population believes the system is rigged, that undermines trust in the entire process, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
You see, back in 2020, the opposition was actually praising the electoral management system.
Oh, wow.
Former President David Granger even said the election was free and fair. Now they're the ones crying foul and demanding major changes.
Wow. So it's almost like a political version of what have you done for me lately?
Pretty much, yeah.
But ultimately, it's not up to the parties to decide how the election is run, right?
Exactly. The Guyana Elections Commission, or GECOM, is the body responsible for making those decisions.
Okay, so what's GECOM's take on all of this?
Okay.
Where do they stand on the biometrics issue?
Well, the GECOM chairperson, retired Justice Claudette Singh, has actually decided to shelve the idea of mandatory biometrics for now.
Really?
Yeah, she cites legal and logistical challenges as the main reasons.
You've shared some of GECOM's statements on this. Could we dig into those a bit? What exactly are the challenges they're facing?
Of course, one major issue is the question of infrastructure. Guyana has a lot of remote interior regions, and implementing a reliable biometric system across the entire country
Right.
could be a huge logistical hurdle,
Yeah.
not to mention the potential cost.
I see. So even if they wanted to implement biometrics, actually making it work everywhere could be a real challenge.
Exactly.
Are there any other concerns they've raised?
Yes. They've also talked about legal hurdles.
Like what?
For example, there might be data privacy issues that need to be addressed before they can legally collect and store biometric data from voters.
So are they ruling out biometrics completely, or is there still a possibility it could be used in this election?
They're not closing the door entirely.
Okay.
The chairperson has said it could be used as a supplemental tool, but only if those legal and logistical challenges are addressed.
That makes sense. It sounds like they're trying to be pragmatic and prioritize what's feasible, at least for this election.
Yeah, I think so.
But I'm guessing this isn't the end of the story.
Not at all. There's a meeting scheduled between the PPP and GECOM to try and clear up all the confusion and misinformation that's swirling around this issue.
So this whole debate is far from over. It seems like there's a lot of distrust on both sides. I'm curious to know more about GECOM's decision-making process.
Okay.
How did they arrive at this conclusion to put mandatory biometrics on hold?
Oh, right.
What factors did they consider? And maybe more importantly, how are they trying to address these concerns about transparency and fairness that we've been talking about?
Those are all excellent questions, and luckily your sources offer some more insights into GECOM's perspective.
So let's get back to GECOM and their decision to hold off on mandatory biometrics.
Okay.
You mentioned that the sources provide a bit more context on their reasoning.
Yeah, they do. GECOM seems to be approaching this from a very practical perspective.
Okay.
They've made it clear that their primary concern is ensuring a free and fair election,
Right.
one where every eligible voter has an equal opportunity to cast their ballot. And right now, they believe that mandatory biometrics could actually jeopardize that goal.
That's interesting. I mean, it seems counterintuitive. You'd think that stricter ID requirements would make the election more secure, not less.
Yeah.
So help me understand this. How could biometrics potentially make things worse?
Well, as we discussed earlier, a big part of it comes down to those logistical challenges.
Okay.
Imagine trying to roll out a brand new biometric system across a country with geographically diverse and often remote communities.
Yeah.
GECOM is worried that in practice, this could disenfranchise voters who might not have easy access to registration centers or who might struggle with the technology itself.
That makes sense. A lot of people live in rural areas and internet access can be spotty.
Right.
So if the biometric system relies on having a good internet connection, you can easily see how that could create a barrier for some voters.
Exactly. And GECOM seems particularly concerned about the potential for delays and confusion at polling stations.
Okay.
If people aren't familiar with the technology, or if there are technical glitches.
Right.
That could lead to long lines, frustration, and ultimately people being turned away.
Wow. So they're really trying to think through all the potential consequences.
Yeah.
And make sure they're not creating more problems than they're solving.
Exactly.
But I still wonder, is there a way to address those concerns and still make biometrics work? Or are they just fundamentally incompatible with Guyana's current situation?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
It really depends on how committed the government is to making it work.
Right.
If they're willing to invest the time and resources needed to create a robust and accessible system, then perhaps biometrics could be a viable option in the future.
Okay.
But it's clear that GECOM isn't convinced that's possible right now.
So for this upcoming election, they're sticking with the existing system.
Right.
But are they doing anything to improve the current system and address those concerns about potential fraud and manipulation?
Yes, absolutely. They've actually outlined a number of measures they're taking to enhance security and transparency.
Like what?
For example, they've increased the number of poll watchers and are implementing stricter procedures for verifying voter identities.
Okay, so they're taking steps to make the process more robust, even without introducing biometrics. That's good to know, but I'm still kind of stuck on this whole debate.
Yeah.
It seems like both sides have valid points. On the one hand, you have the opposition who are worried about fraud and see biometrics as a solution.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you have GECOM who are worried about disenfranchisement and see biometrics as a potential problem. So how do you reconcile those two perspectives?
It's a classic dilemma, isn't it? And as we mentioned earlier, it's one that's playing out all over the world. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. But if we look at some global examples, we can see that both sides have a point. In some countries, biometrics have been very successful in streamlining the voting process, reducing fraud, and increasing confidence in the results.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a really positive outcome.
Yeah.
What kind of successes are we talking about?
Well, for example, in India, they've implemented a massive biometric voter ID program
Okay.
that has helped to significantly reduce voter impersonation and eliminate duplicate registrations.
Wow.
And in Brazil, they've used biometrics to speed up the voting process and make it more efficient.
So it seems like it can work, but I guess the question is, does that success translate to every context?
That's the crux of it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the answer is no.
Okay.
There are also plenty of examples where biometric voting has been problematic, even disastrous.
Oh, wow.
In some cases, it's led to technical glitches that disenfranchise voters, especially those in marginalized communities.
Right.
And there are also concerns about data privacy and the potential for abuse.
That makes sense. You're basically saying the technology itself isn't a magic bullet. It's about the context in which it's used.
Right.
And how well it's implemented.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the specifics of Guyana's situation.
Okay.
GECOM seems to be erring on the side of caution.
Yeah.
And you can understand why if they rush to implement biometrics without addressing those logistical and legal challenges, they could end up creating a system that is even less fair and accessible than the one they have now.
I see what you mean. It's a really delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
You have to weigh the potential benefits against the risks, and there's no easy answer, but I'm still curious to hear more about those potential risks.
Okay.
What are some of the specific concerns about data privacy and potential abuse that you mentioned?
One major concern is that if the biometric data isn't properly secured, it could be vulnerable to hacking or misuse.
Right.
We've seen data breaches happen in all sorts of contexts, and voter registration databases are no exception.
Yeah.
Imagine if someone were able to access and manipulate that information. It could be used for identity theft, targeted disinformation campaigns, or even to influence the outcome of the election.
That's a chilling thought, and it's not just a hypothetical problem, right?
Absolutely.
We've seen real-world examples of this kind of thing happening.
Exactly. And it's not just external threats that are a concern.
Okay.
There's also the question of how the government itself might use this data.
Right.
Could it be used to target political opponents or suppress dissent? These are questions that need to be addressed before any kind of biometric system is implemented.
So it's not just about the technology itself, but also about the political and social context in which it's being used.
Exactly.
You really have to think through all the potential consequences.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
And it's a complex picture, for sure. This whole debate in Guyana is a microcosm of a much larger global conversation about the role of technology in democracy.
Wow.
It raises fundamental questions about security, privacy, accessibility, and trust.
You're right. It's about more than just who wins and loses this election. It's about the future of democracy itself.
Exactly.
And it's a debate that we all need to be engaged in.
Absolutely. So what are your initial thoughts? What stands out to you from all of this information?
Honestly, what strikes me the most is just how interconnected all of these issues are.
Yeah.
You can't really talk about biometrics without talking about infrastructure or demographics or data privacy or even the broader political climate. It's all intertwined.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a system, and you have to consider the system as a whole.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. This is about real people and their right to vote.
Right.
And in Guyana right now, the stakes are incredibly high.
That's right. A disputed election could lead to instability protests, even violence.
Yeah.
We've seen it happen in other countries, and it's scary to think about. But, okay, let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of the people making these decisions.
Okay.
Let's say Guyana does decide to go all in on biometric voting in the future. Okay.
What are some of the key things they would need to do to make sure it's implemented responsibly and doesn't end up backfiring?
That's a great question, and it brings us to some critical considerations.
So we were talking about what Guyana would need to consider if they decide to move forward with biometrics in the future.
Right.
Yeah. Like, what would that look like?
Well, first and foremost, they would need to make a serious investment in infrastructure.
Okay.
That means ensuring reliable internet access across the entire country.
Right.
Especially in those remote interior regions that we talked about.
Right, yeah.
They'd also need to make sure that the registration process is accessible to everyone.
Okay.
Including people with disabilities, the elderly, and those who might not be tech savvy.
Yeah, that sounds like a massive undertaking, especially for a country with limited resources. But
it is.
I guess if they're serious about making this work, they have to be willing to put in the effort, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just about the physical infrastructure.
They would also need to invest in robust cybersecurity measures to protect that biometric data.
Right.
We talked about the potential for hacking and misuse earlier.
Yeah.
And those risks would only increase if they're dealing with a nationwide database.
Yeah, you shared some reports on past data breaches in other countries.
Right.
It seems like there's always someone trying to find a way to exploit these systems.
There is.
So security has to be a top priority.
Without a doubt. And it's not just about preventing external attacks.
Right.
They also need to think about internal threats and make sure there are safeguards in place to prevent anyone from abusing the system for political gain.
So strong cybersecurity, transparent data management, independent audits, all of that would be essential.
It would be.
But even if they get all of that right, there's still the question of public trust, right?
Yeah.
How do they convince people that this system is actually fair and secure,
right,
and that their data is being protected?
That's the key to all of this. They need to be completely transparent about how the system works, how the data is being used, and what steps they're taking to protect people's privacy.
Okay.
They also need to engage with the public and address any concerns head on.
Yeah.
Basically, they need to demonstrate through their actions that they are committed to using this technology responsibly and ethically.
It sounds like a tall order, but it seems like the alternative, just sticking with the status quo, isn't really a viable option either, especially with all this distrust swirling around.
Yeah.
So what do you think, is there a path forward for Guyana? Can they find a way to balance these competing demands for security and accessibility?
That's the big question. And I think the answer depends on whether they can foster a culture of trust and collaboration.
Okay.
If they can get all the stakeholders the political parties, GECOM, civil society groups, everyone on the same page, working together toward a common goal, then I think they have a chance.
It sounds like you're saying this isn't just a technical challenge.
No, it's not.
Yeah, but a political and social one as well.
Ultimately, the success of any electoral system, whether it uses biometrics or not, depends on the people who are implementing it and the people who are participating in it.
So true. Well, I have to say, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
Oh, good. I love it.
You've really helped me to understand the complexities of this issue.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And I think the key takeaway for me is that there are no easy answers.
Right.
It's about finding the right balance for each specific context. And that requires careful consideration, open dialogue, and a commitment to transparency and accountability.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, before we wrap up, I have to ask our signature deep dive question.
Okay.
If you were in charge of running this election in Guyana, knowing everything we've just discussed, how would you approach this whole biometrics issue?
Ooh, that's a tough one, honestly. I think I would take a cautious approach. Given the current situation, with all the logistical challenges, the lack of trust, the potential for things to go wrong, I'd probably hold off on mandatory biometrics for now.
Yeah.
But I would definitely start laying the groundwork for the future.
So focus on building that foundation of trust and addressing those infrastructure and security concerns before making any big changes.
Exactly. I would prioritize making the existing system as secure and transparent as possible, while also exploring the feasibility of biometrics as a long-term solution.
That sounds like a sensible approach, and it speaks to that idea of finding the right balance for each specific context.
Right. It's not about being pro-biometrics or anti-biometrics.
Yeah.
It's about finding what works best for Guyana and its people.
Well said. Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure picking your brain.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for coming along for the ride. We hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. Stay curious, stay engaged, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.